Okay.
All right,
Hi,
guys.
everyone.
Go ahead, hon.
Nice to see some faces that aren't my mother. Love you, Mom. But did I lose us?
Nope, you're here.
Okay, there we go. Okay, there we go. Okay, so keep in mind my friends will have a viewing party of this later, so let's make it a good one. I'm Tessa Porter, and I did my presentation on shame culture surrounding men. When I first started this presentation, I studied male stereotypes and how they negatively affect behavior. But the more research I did, the more it became prevalent that shame was an influencer of those stereotypes and behaviors. So I changed my project to shame. So last year I did an essay about male stereotypes, and I came upon this quote from Sunrise with Sea Monsters, Being a Man by Paul Theroux. And he says, "Man means manly. How can one think about men without thinking about the terrible ambition of manliness?" I love this quote because I love the term manliness because I think it's the embodiment of all of those negative stereotypes of to be a man, to man up, all of that. And I think the terrible ambition of manliness is a great way to talk about the power and the structure that being a man was based around. Sorry, my cat just jumped up. So my thesis was to improve male mental health and increase gender equality. Our society should prioritize education of shame culture and work to end the cycle that creates toxic masculinity. In my paper, I was able to expand into a lot of different areas. This is a really big topic, especially sexual relationships, which I wasn't able to include in here, but that could be like a thesis in itself. But to shorten it down for this presentation, I decided to talk about the things that I feel like I could assist Montezuma County in. So I focused on what shame is, how it's applied through homophobia and femininity, and what it results in, which is depression, is the link that I found. So my goal is to present the effects, how they're applied to men, and my contribution to aiding the shame culture in Montezuma County for men. So starting off, just a little bit about shame. This is from a research done by Tracy and Robbins in the Theory and Research on the Self-Conscious Emotions. So they conclude that shame is one of the 4 self-conscious emotions next to guilt, pride, and embarrassment. And the definition of a self-conscious emotion is based on the appraisal-based model they made in 2004, where the self-conscious emotion is caused by the personal interpretation of a situation's inference to identity. So some important aspects about shame is the difference between shame and guilt. Shame and guilt are often used as synonymous terms, but they're very different things. So guilt is the feeling that comes with a negative behavior, and shame is the feeling of being something wrong. So guilt is the feeling with doing something wrong, and shame is the feeling of being something wrong. Guilt is an action, shame is an identity. They're both used as remedial purposes, like the classic grandma guilt trip, you never come see me anymore. Guilt tripping is the huge thing. But they have opposite effects, which is really important to note because shame's also used to remediate behavior, but it doesn't do the same thing. So guilt will cause somebody to feel remorse and to apologize, but shame ends up causing isolation and usually the refusal to even acknowledge behavior. So there's a lot more about shame, but we're short on time. So the most important thing I wanted to talk about is how several research studies indicated it was correlated to depression. And that's what I'll talk about later as the effects of shame culture. So because shame is a feeling that goes with a behavior that's unaccepted, and we're studying men, this tends to revolve around feminine behaviors and homosexuality. So to study homophobia, I looked at a study conducted in 1996 by Henry Adams Lester Wright Jr. and Bethany Lohr from the University of Georgia. This is a really popular study. It took 64 men that identified as heterosexual, 35 were homophobic and 25 were non-homophobic, and they viewed 3 4-minute clips of heterosexual porn, female homosexual, and male homosexual pornography. And then they were asked to personally rate their perceived arousal levels, and they recorded, the researchers recorded the engorgement levels with a plethysmograph. So the plethysmograph rates the change of volume in a body part based on blood flow. So it was attached to the penis, and they actually could quantify their arousal level. So the results did prove possible correlation between homophobia and internalized homosexual desires. The results showed that the blood flow to the penis matched the self-rated sexual arousal for both homophobic and non-homophobic groups regarding the heterosexual and female homosexual porn. So their perceived rate of arousal matched what was proven with the plethysmograph. But the blood flow to the penis did not match the personal perceived level of sexual arousal for the homophobic group in response to the male homosexual porn. So this study did have some possible errors, considering that stress can be a factor that affects physical arousal. But I thought it was important to educate, because the possible relationship between internalized homophobia and homosexual desires could make it less possible for straight males to use homophobia as a way to prove their heterosexuality, which is what I see a lot, especially in the small rural areas like this. So I thought it was an important thing to show, just to keep it in people's minds that that's a possibility. And it does a good job of showing the cycle of shame, of how it comes from internalized behaviors or internalized emotions, and then external behaviors on other people, and it can just create a cycle. So there is a lot of anecdotal evidence on the shame culture surrounding femininity in men, but to get a more abstract view of it, I looked at 3 studies that had to do with interpretation of competence in relation to perceived femininity in the workplace, because that's an important application of it, especially right now when the Me Too movement was super huge, and sexual assault in the workplace, stuff like that. So the first one I looked at was Yago and Vrooms, which was a study from Applied Psychology, the Journal of Applied Psychology, in 1982. And this study looked at the evaluation of autocratic versus participative behaviors. The study concluded that men were evaluated as superior to women when they exhibited autocratic behaviors, and equal to women when they exhibited participative behaviors. And this was at a time when female leadership wasn't popular and wasn't common. And so being viewed as equal to female leaders was a negative aspect they saw it as. And they were viewed as equal to females when they participated, which I feel like we can all agree is like a good quality to have, but it still lowered their score. So the next study I looked at was Laurie A. Rudman in 1998, part of the Society for Psychological Study of Social Issues. This study looked at the evaluation of self-effacing behaviors, so humble behaviors. And it found that self-effacing behaviors decreased competence perceptions for men, but not for women. So if a female leader was humble, that was neutral for her. But if a male leader was humble, it decreased his score. And the last one was my favorite, Heilman and Wallen in 2010, part of, again, the Journal of Applied Psychology. And this one looked at the evaluation of success in a feminine job. So this found that men extract and they called it a wimpiness penalty, when they were successful in a stereotypically feminine job. So this was super interesting for me, because this was not penalty for feminine behavior, this was penalty for success in a feminine job. This linked kind of to how, the feminine behaviors were communication and being humble, and those were seen as feminine, and it lessened their success, which I think is super important to look at, because success, I feel, is a large part of what men's worth has been based on in the past and now, and the fact that feminine behaviors lowered that success created this negative view of femininity in men. This also links to Thoreau's comment, which is a reading that I did last year, on the American male writer. So during his time, it was common for American male writers to have to prove their masculinity in work because it was seen as a feminine job. And so it became a trend for male writers to write about heroes that were very aggressive. Outside of their writing, they were aggressive. They over-sexualized women, and they also dealt with alcoholism and would show that to the world. My favorite is Hemingway is the best example of this, and he also unfortunately died by suicide, which kind of leads me to my next topic of the effects of shame that I researched, which is male depression. So it's shown that alcoholism and suicide rates are higher in men, especially with depression. So what I looked at is male depression, which is a recently new term to studies, but it talks about the difference in symptoms between female and male depression. So they experience a lot of the same things: fatigue, loss of interest in activities, day-to-day stuff. But one thing that men were found to experience a lot more than women was aggression. And I thought that was important because a large part of our society's fear of men is aggression and violence. And so that was important to look at, of how aggression is caused, or at least correlated to depression, and how depression is correlated to shame. I also looked at low report rates for men. So according to a 2003 National Institute of Mental Health public forum, it's called Real Men, Real Depression. Men were found to be unlikely to admit to depressive symptoms or seek help for them. So it's seen as kind of a women's issue. There was also a statistic that females were twice as likely to have experienced depression, this is from the CDC, than men were in their lifetime, but it's a lot less likely for men to report it. So the male depression does not get a lot of attention, and it also is downplayed because they don't report it, and then they're the aspects of it, like the aggression and stuff, that will just continue to build, and it also leads to drug abuse and suicide. Yeah, that's about it, I think. Just talking about how part of why I believe it goes unreported is because the shame that's often applied to males for mental health. A lot of time it's seen as feminine to be hurt or to care about things, and so I think that shame surrounding having trouble being okay is causing a lot of unreported parts of male depression. So as an application to this for Montezuma County, I thought that I would make a website. And I did this, I called it Boys R Us, because my brother, Noah Porter, is kind of the thing that got me onto this project. I've always loved boys. Noah's been my best friend since childhood. And we'd always go to Toys R Us, and we would spend hours in there looking for toys. And he, up until older than he would like me to tell you, he played with me with toys. And my mom told me a story of when he was really little, and he would have her paint his nails, and he showed up to school one day with them painted, and a female teacher told him that that's weird and that's not what boys do. And so he came home, and keep in mind, he was maybe 6 or 7 years old, made her take off the nail polish, my mom, and did not tell her what happened. he was so ashamed of what it was and embarrassed, he didn't tell my mom like what had happened, and so she had to talk to the teacher of like why he came home so upset. And no matter what she said to him, he wouldn't let her paint his nails after that. And my brother's also a macho man. He's a woods guy, hunter, and he still wanted to do that when he was little. So I don't know if we have time. Copeland, are we running okay? You're muted.
I know, yeah. No, you're running, you've got about 30 seconds.
Okay, yeah. So just talking about my website, I put articles about male stereotypes, sexual assault against men, stuff that doesn't get a lot of coverage. And then I also put articles about sexual assault, harassment in the workplace, things like that. So boys have a safe space to go to learn about those problems without feeling like they did something wrong or looking ignorant. And that's my project.
All right, excellent. Questions? Tracy? You're muted.
Sorry about that. I'll try to have Tessa kind of connect her research to our new reality here with the pandemic. Much of what you focused on has to deal with male gender roles. There's also embedded within our culture the expected male role of being the primary provider for a family, usually. Our economy has just been devastated. And as you mentioned, part of shame stems from, according to your research, a state of being or not being something. Now we have a huge percentage of people all over the place who are in the state of not being good providers for folks who count upon them. What might we expect to see as a society from such a widespread moment of collective shame for people?
This is super interesting because I was just looking at a video today about how people were against raising minimum wage and talking about how it was just a teenage job, and now a lot of the teenagers who work at grocery stores are the essential service providers for their family, and the only ones who are allowed to work right now. And so I think that is super huge, especially not only men being out of work, but children being in work. I hope after this that there actually will be a more kind understanding of what it means to be a provider. And I hope that instead of seeing more negativity from the shame, I hope that it'll be understanding of appreciation. But there is a little bit of worry that people will be defensive in why their jobs or like not being able to provide for their family. So I hope that this will teach the younger generations, the males my age, to not think that way. I think that this experience will teach them that being a provider is not what makes you human, because the rest of their family is staying home and working to keep their mental health up. And so I hope that this will help my generation view shame from protecting a family in a different way. I don't know if I answered your question, but
fairly well. But I'll bring it. I'll try to add a little bit more focus and then pass it to someone else. You've made you say there's a correlation between shame, depression, and aggression. We've got a whole lot of people shut into their homes right now. What might we as a society expect to see in the very short term from this? What could we possibly do to make it better?
So I mean, especially now that things are online, providing an online space, which I hope my website can kind of provide for kids, because I've even seen my own friends experiencing some minor emotional abuse at home from concentrated, and it actually does tend to be from the male adult that isn't being able to provide. And I think opening, like when schools reopen, having at least a mandatory class maybe that can just be talking about it, analyzing what's happened, because I think a lot of kids are going to come out of this with some damage.
Okay. Let's move on to Ms. Mason.
So you talked about these masculine behaviors, like where do they come from? Why do they exist in our society? And do they exist similarly in other societies?
Yeah, so I talked about that a lot in my paper, but about how it became from like primitive behavior to attract a female as a mate. Fighting was a very popular form of that, and it is now. And I talked about how we unknowingly still completely prescribe to that showing. I talked about in my paper sexual relations. There's two sides of this with females appreciating male aggression, because part of it is now, especially with the Me Too movement, it's a anti-men thing, but there's still so much culture out there with media that exerts male aggression as a form of drawing in female female viewers because of that aggression. There was even an interview with a person who was in a show, and halfway through the season his character beat his wife, and after that he talked about how women would approach him constantly on the press releases in a very more sexual manner after that. So I think that primitive part of aggression and protection, that's what caused it, and it's still causing it, because that's another thing about the shame, is we're punishing men for that behavior, but we have an entire aspect of our society that promotes it and needs it for sexual relations.
Okay, let's do a real quick one. Ms. Maggie. Go ahead, you're muted. I'm gonna unmute you. Gotcha.
Sorry. So the stereotypes, like you were talking about, like Noah getting shamed for wearing fingernail polish. Trent has been called a fag before for wearing pink. What can we do as a society to start changing that?
So right now, I've actually, and this was in Paul Theroux's writing about how the feminist movement has done almost just as much for men as it has for women. We're seeing a lot more acceptance in feminine dress wear with men now, with actors, actresses, musicians. I think there's an aspect of our culture that, or at least I know in my age girls, that like appreciates that. And so I think so far we've been doing a better job at showing that. There are a lot of musical artists out there, men, that dress feminine but aren't gay, and so I think they're proving that stereotype wrong. And I think showing the facts behind why that's okay is what we need to do, because some people might look at that and not understand it, that they dress that way but still aren't homosexual. And so I think providing a background of knowledge on the difference between expressing yourself, gender, and sex.
Do you think that somehow the schools could help with that, like with kids starting at a younger age?
That was my biggest.
What would that look like?
I think making classrooms try to be neutral and picking stories that they tell kids to be neutral. A lot of the stories are, the princess and the boy that comes to rescue her. And I think that does just as much damage for boys as it does for girls to listen to that. And so I think finding new ways, new stories to read to the little kids And I think even addressing it outright, I think talking to them and just describing what gender means and what sex means and how you can dress yourself and how you can express yourself. And I think actually having classes with those kids early on before they've adopted their parents' view or, you know, something on the internet.
Okay.
And not targeting it for that femininity, but just open.
All right.
Thank you.
Let's end this meeting, and thank you very much, Tessa.
Thank you all.